Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, check us out on all of the major podcast platforms that are out there. You know, you can take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go. And if you're listening to us on one of those platforms, you want to check out what's happening in the studio, check out our YouTube channel, subscribe, leave a like, leave a review, and most importantly, let your friends know and your family members know about about what's going on here on the Lunch Hour. We really appreciate that word of mouth. Have a great show today. We're going to be joined by a couple of guests, Tim Lee as well as Daniel Ikenson. Let me read Tim's bio first. Tim is the Senior Vice President of Legal and Public Affairs at the Center for Individual Freedom, an Alexandria, Virginia-based nonprofit organization established in 1998 to protect constitutional rights, promote free market principles, and advance international liberty. Prior to joining CFIF in 2006, Mr. Lee practiced practiced labor and employment law and commercial litigation law firms in L.A., Phoenix, at such places as Morgan, Lewis and Bockius and Quarles and Brady. He also served as an in-house labor and employment counsel at the Chubb Group. And Tim, I think I may have had you on the show before. I got to go back and remember. And then, of course, Daniel Ikenson. He is the founder of Ikensonomics Consulting, which specializes in strategic analysis, issue advocacy, policy writing, and public engagement. Prior to founding Ikensonomics, Daniel was the director of trade, investment, and innovation at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Daniel was also the former director of policy research at NDP Analytics and the former director of the Cato Institute Center for Trade and Policy Studies, where he researched, wrote, and spoke about trade policy in October 1990 until 2001. Prior to that, he was the director of international trade planning for an international accounting and business advisory firm. He co-founded the Library of International Trade Resources, an internet consulting firm providing interactive information access and international trade consulting. Also is the author of Expose the Devilish Details of Unfair Trade Law, somebody I very much want to talk to about these things. Gentlemen, I'm so glad you can join me today, because we're going to talk about the FTC. We spent a lot of time talking with the various guests about the problems with the FTC. And I guess let's start here, which is there's a real posture change over at the Federal Trade Commission regarding a whole host of issues. What has changed under the leadership of Lina Khan?
Well, ironically, I'll go ahead and start. Ironically, what's happening is the FTC under the Biden administration and Chairwoman Lina Khan, they're becoming more aggressive and trying to expand their powers precisely at the time where in recent years the Supreme Court has been checking administrative state abuse and saying you've gone too far over the last 40 and 50 years, and they're reining it back in. And so they're engaging in a lot of these activities that are going to get thrown out in court based on recent Supreme Court decisions. The problem is they're going full speed ahead anyway, which just wastes uncounted hours of judicial resources, financial resources fighting these things out. But junk fees are one of those examples where they are overstepping their authority because they believe in a very strong administrative state precisely when they're becoming checked. And so it's kind of, that adds an irony.
Yeah, we'll talk about the junk fee issue in a second. I mean, Dan, you agree with that there's this activist stance that's happened over at the FTC?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the case throughout the regulatory agencies. I mean, it's been growing as executive power grabs have been continuing for decades. I mean, it shifts a little bit from one presidency to the next, but this is the worst in terms of the number of regulations, the cost of regulations in the regulatory agencies that deal with the manufacturing sector, that deal with the services sector, banking. There is this mentality that Wall Street, that certain industries are adversaries and not important organs of the economy. So this junk fee thing is it totally misunderstands economics and pricing and the costs of sort of this rampant abuse are going to backfire, and we'll be feeling it pretty soon.
Let me ask a philosophical question for a moment of both of you, because you both have spent a lot of time in the free market, limited government, libertarian, small L libertarian worlds. And I'm gonna pose this before we get to the issue. Which is worse? Is it worse to have an adversarial relationship between the regulatory agencies, like an angry adversarial relationship, truly adversarial relationship between the agencies and the regulated entities that are out there? Or is it worse to have a cozy relationship between the regulated entities where they're essentially acting as not adjuncts, but where the agencies have this relationship and they can drive the regulatory process, sometimes to the detriment, in many cases, to the detriment of their competitors? Either one. I mean, Dan, I'm going to start with you because you have your Cato pedigree, and then we'll go to Tim.
I think the answer is Goldilocks, right? We need to find the right balance. But I mean, the way to address that, I think, is at the root. The fact is we have too many regulations. There's too much power in Washington.
Yes.
Too much power in the state capitals, but Washington writ large at the federal level. If we were to pass laws more judiciously, if the Congress, when we talk about regulations, we tend to place all the blame on the executive branch, but Congress has been asleep at the wheel too. They don't legislate. They hold hearings. They don't want to be held accountable for laws that may go awry. They need to do a better job of making sure that we, that we reduce the code of federal regulations, or the laws that give birth to these regulations, and we need a regulatory environment that does what it's supposed to do, which is to, compensate for possible market failures, things that can't be adjusted, but that the purpose shouldn't be set by the regulatory agencies.
Right.
They should be there to as guardrails, as gentle guardrails.
But before you answer that question, Tim, because I had this conversation, Dan, many years ago, with a member of Congress chairing a subcommittee on government reform and oversight, and he asked me that question, whose fault is this, expecting me to beat up on the agencies? And I said, Congressman, frankly, it's in no small measure your fault. You and your colleagues. The more vague laws you pass, the more power you give to these agencies. And this was, of course, at the height of the Chevron era, which we may come back to and get back to. But Tim, go ahead. Your thoughts here on this. Is it a Goldilocks situation?
Yes, it is. And to specifically answer your question, I would say that in an ideal world, that there should be more cooperation, in the sense that they shouldn't have to constantly be fighting these things out, because what happens, you waste a lot of resources, and it may sound odd for an attorney like myself to be saying this, but you waste a lot of resources on attorneys fighting them. And so to the degree that we can all sort of say, hey, look, here's the ideal in a perfect world of how government could function, like Dan just said, the fact that they could sort of work things out without the need for litigation and that hard adversarial relationship, that would be good. The problem is, as you brilliantly pointed out, unfortunately, that can lead to crony capitalism. What I would say is, in an ideal world, there's more cooperation, because the people that are regulated that you referenced, they don't just include the big companies that can engage in crony capitalism, but they include smaller companies that don't engage in that. So I would say, yes, we would love cooperation that includes those people as well. But when it crosses that line and those guardrails that Dan referenced, and it gets into crony capitalism, bad things.
Yeah, there was a situation during the George W. Bush administration in which OSHA had created a really innovative program in order to get compliance. We all agree there ought to be workplace safety, and there should probably be workplace safety rules. We can get to the degree of that, but they had an OSHA consultation system, which was a way of working in a consultative process to get businesses into compliance. It was a great program, of course, thrown out because OSHA wasn't doing enough, engaged in enough enforcement actions with under the Obama administration. So let's go here. Let's talk about this, gents. Is there a junk fee problem in America, and how are we defining, and how are they defining junk fees? Whoever wants to jump in can jump in there.
Sure. To me, the battle against junk fees is the Biden administration's greater war on prices, or the war on greed. inflation manifests itself, in the past few years, and I think it was a product of a lot of government spending. We had, 4 major authorizations for like trillions of dollars of spending, and so the funny thing is we hear about the dangers of populism, and we often hear Donald Trump associated with that particular thing. But to me, the Biden administration is engaging in a lot of populism here. You have a problem with your gas prices. Well, we'll tap the strategic reserve. You're tired of paying off your student loans. Well, we'll wipe them off and let taxpayers and your neighbors subsidize that problem. Every sort of issue that could come up where the administration is thinking, how am I going to ingratiate ourselves to the voter? They come up with these junk fee ideas, but these are just ways of differentiating prices, and that's an important part of economics. If junk fees are annoying, it's kind of a pain, and maybe takes you a little bit longer to do comparative shopping. When you kind of get hit at the end and realize, we have to pay these extra fees. But caveat emptor, you know what you have to deal with to get there. Let's keep this private. It doesn't mean just because this is an annoyance that we have to have another avenue for the federal government to come in and be a traffic cop.
Tim?
I agree with that, and I would add sort of an illustration. And people of reasonable mind can disagree on this. I actually prefer what they falsely call junk fees. So, for instance, when I'm on an airline, I don't need a checked bag. I am okay with them charging a different rate for somebody who doesn't even bring a carry-on bag. I sometimes fly, I won't name the airlines, but sometimes they give you a $10 charge for a carry-on bag. Maybe I don't need that. Maybe it's a quick trip. I'm just doing my personal item. I like that. All I care about is getting to the destination. I can do it cheaply. I don't need to pack 74 days worth. They call that a junk fee. I call that reducing the overall price and giving the consumer choice. And so they're targeting something that a lot of consumers prefer. And if you eliminate these and prohibit them artificially, people are going to pay higher overall prices for things, and they don't get that. And so I'm very much in favor of them. And the very term junk fee is a misnomer, and it's their way of slandering them.
It's a situation. I give you 2 examples, right? There's one airline, there was a discount airline that flies out of one of the local airports near me. And it could be very convenient to fly one of my kids back and forth to where they were going to college at the time. But it wound up being the same price once you added everything on as another airline. And, I chose to go with another airline, though on occasion I would go here. One of the things that gets me, and again, I'm not saying I oppose this, though I am bothered by it. I find it annoying, right? When I buy a ticket online, which I know, like a ticket to like a movie or a concert or something, and I know that I'm saving them money by not going to the box office, but I get charged a convenience fee. Like, I find that annoying, right? And maybe I would consider that sorry, go ahead. Oh, Dan, I thought you were popping in there. But the point is, I don't think that I need the FTC to step in there and regulate this issue of the convenience fee. I should be able to vote with my feet in my pocket because, you know something, I'm not gonna patronize X movie company because they're charging me a $5 convenience fee on top of this. I mean, that's what we're getting at here, isn't it?
It is, and what's happening is you get what you pay for. These fees, typically, they pay for something of which the consumer may be unaware. So when you talk about overdraft fees or late charges, and they may sound annoying to you, but you know what? If you're the type of consumer that pays his or her bills on time and you keep your nose clean in that regard, it's good to have that because you pay a lower rate, et cetera. And it may seem annoying to some people, but that benefits people who play by the rules and just want to engage in that sort of choice.
Actually, this gets into something that Dan talked about early on in the show, which is, the issue of the overall agenda. And one of the things that the left has been pushing on for a long time is they want to remove the concept of risk assessment, right? And we could talk about risk assessment in terms of risk of harm, but on the financial side of it is what I'm talking about here. The idea that a business should be able to assess the risk of lending somebody money or engaging in a business practice, and the government wants to get rid of that. That has huge impacts on the financial services sector, and even in areas like this. I mean, am I reading that right?
Yes, you are. I mean, you are. There are costs to banks and credit card companies for late payment, for overdraft, things like that. They could just, take that aggregate number and then and divide it off, over the entire customer base. But that's not necessarily fair. Let them identify the people that want to use that service or incur those costs, not be as be the timely payer. Let the fees go directed to where the people that incur those costs exist. So there's something in economics called reservation prices. Businesses would love to sell. They deal with an aggregate demand curve, but they would love to sell to you at the highest price that you're willing to pay for. So I go to the grocery store, and if I'm not that price sensitive, I don't clip coupons necessarily. Coupons are available to allow businesses to charge different prices for the same product, essentially the same product. That's how they maximize profits. They maximize revenues that way. What the government is doing here with the junk fees is that they're intervening and they're sort of snuffing out the capacity of businesses to identify those reservation prices, what each individual consumer would want, and that requires identifying the product, customizing the product in creative ways. And so this is just another example of government interfering with innovation.
And it gets to this issue of raising prices for everybody else, which is the invariable consequence, isn't it, Tim?
That's exactly right, because these companies have an operating margin and they have to reach a certain price. And whether you get it on a so-called junk fee or anything else, you have to pay for the services provided. And it's not unfair. It's not a junk fee, but it also oversteps the FTC's authority. Congress has specifically pondered legislation here, and they took a pass on it. And when Congress specifically takes a pass on something, that does not open the door for an overly activist administrative agency, which has far less authority than Congress, to do the same thing. And so they're also egregiously overstepping their legal bounds here.
Listen, Rush said it best. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. But before we go down the constitutional road for a second, gents, let's talk about the universe of what we're talking about in terms of this proposal. First, where does the proposal stand in the pipeline?
Right now, this is at the early proposal stage, and so later on, we're going to get to the legal challenge stage. If they try to impose this, you're going to get the legal challenges. There are no guarantees in life, but I can almost guarantee that this will get thrown out. So that's down the road. The things I'm talking about in terms of the legal and constitutional challenges, those will come down the road. But this is one of those things where I think there's a calculation on the FTC's part and Lina Khan, her part, of saying, I know this is going to get thrown out, but you know what? I can harass these businesses enough that maybe they comply anyway, and they just say, look, we'll come to a compromise. It's sort of like threatening a lawsuit that will fail. You can sometimes drive the other side into a settlement unfairly, even though you don't have a chance of beating them. It's a nuisance value almost, and it creates this overhang, this threat to other companies out there saying, better play ball with us and do what we say, or we will sue you under these laws that we know will get thrown out. But in the meantime, you're going to get bad press. We're going to call them junk fees. The public is going to start to hate your company, and you're going to pay a lot of legal fees to do this. And so it serves a purpose, even if they ultimately lose.
Right. And that's the goal, is to they stake out their ideological goal and they march it down the field. But is the docket still open? When does the docket close?
I'm not sure, and Dan may know this more specifically than I do in terms of when it's going to close, but I'm not sure the specific date.
Dan, do you know, is the docket still open on this?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's good. So, but let's talk about this. Coming back to it, this idea of because this is not the first and only time that this administration has stepped in and done things that are, when Congress has said that they're not going to act on something, this is essentially the redux of Barack Obama saying, I have a phone and a pen and I'm not afraid to use them. Talk about that.
I was just going to say that the irony of it in the mainstream media and what a lot of the consumers who are listening to this and consumers out there will hear is when Donald Trump does it, it's creeping fascism. When Barack Obama or Joe Biden do it, it's standing up for the little guy against an intransigent Congress. And so, but it's not. It's abuse of authority because these administrative agencies for the past 40 or 50 years have been abusing their power, whether it's the FTC or the Federal Communications Commission with things like so-called net neutrality, or the Environmental Protection Agency overstepping its bounds, even the Department of Justice. All of these agencies have been overstepping their bounds, and that actually is abuse of power. And so the Supreme Court has fortunately been carving them back. Student loans. I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with the trying to transfer student loan costs onto taxpayers from students who took them out willingly, who make more than people who didn't take them out because their degrees allow them to make higher income levels through the years, and you're shifting it to people less able to pay it. That was thrown out by the courts as well. So I think the student loan transfer to taxpayers is something that a lot of your listeners will immediately be familiar with as well.
You know, it's funny you said that. I'm watching for the first time The West Wing. I never watched it.
Neither did I.
Whatever reason, I decided to start watching it, and I'm now sort of in season 5. And the issue of student loan repayments comes up. And one of the Democratic president's staffers says, "Oh, because that's just what we want to do. We want to make working families pay for the student loan decisions of wealthy individuals." Exactly. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But it raises the issue also. And let me ask you this, Dan, because one of the things that's come up in this election cycle, not that I want to make this political or partisan, but I think it's important to talk about this, is the issue of prices. One of the candidates yesterday was talking about price gouging. Invariably, it will come down to an agency like the FTC to deal with that. That's a very dangerous thing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. We've got the election coming up. We'll see how things go. Tim just pointed out an instance where the Supreme Court tried to rein in Biden's efforts to deal with student loans. A lot of cases, with the Chevron deference issue, they just deferred and they did it. So, like I said earlier, we blame the executive branch when in fact Congress has a role to play here. We need the way to get at the problem, I think, is to just lay down rules. Right now, the regulators are going to do what they're allowed to do. And with Chevron deference, they were allowed to come up with a reasonable interpretation of an ambiguous law, not the proper interpretation. So once legislation is written in such a way that there is less latitude for interpretation and that the regulatory regime can continue from one administration to the next, regardless of party, so there's not these, major shifts, that's when we'll be in a better place. But, the courts have an important role to play here too. They're going to have to roll up their sleeves and earn their living as well and tell us what the law says. So, I did a paper earlier this year on regulation and how out of control it is. And my initial instinct was, we really need to assail executive power grabs, but it's there for the taking, because the other branches have just not done their job. So I think if we approach this holistically and don't just assign blame, to one branch, we're more likely to get this fixed over time. I don't know how long it's going to take for Loper Bright to kick in and for the Chevron deference decisions to be watered down or to go away. But, Tim probably has a much better idea about that. But it's
funny. I've got a staffer, the policy work that I do, working on pulling together a list of Supreme Court cases in which there were crazy regulatory interpretations that were nevertheless upheld because of because of Chevron deference, sort of as a way of sort of revisiting those rules. And before you came on, Dan, Tim and I were talking about, Kent Lastman from the Competitive Enterprise Institute was a guest a couple of weeks back on the show. And we were talking about potential reforms to the Administrative Procedure Act. And again, this idea of making sure we rein in, because in all too many cases or situations, these agencies are trying to sidestep the regulatory process by doing things in more informal rulemakings, what Wayne Cruz calls regulatory dark matter. Let me ask you guys both about this, because we're talking about these independent agencies. One of the other things we spent time talking about on these shows is the power of the administrative courts within these agencies, right? It's not just that the agencies have the power, but if you are pursued administratively by the FTC's administrative court, you're really behind the eight ball here. So it really doesn't matter what the law says because you're already up against the wall. I mean, Tim, talk about that, because I know this is of interest to you.
Yeah, for listeners out there who are sort of unfamiliar with this, the best way of conceptualizing this is to think of these administrative agencies as appointing themselves judge, jury, and executioner. They try to have these in-house courts where the agency itself is suing. Well, the judge is also employed by that same agency, renders a verdict, and then they mete out the punishment. Judge, jury, and executioner. That's not how our system works. And the fortunate thing, once again, is that the judicial branch has been stepping in and throwing out administrative policies that do that. If I could add one thing really quickly, also for listeners who are sort of trying to conceptualize all of this, in the Declaration of Independence, which founded our country, one of the reasons listed for wanting to declare independence from Britain was that the king was sending out his administrative minions and harassing the colonists with all of these rules and imposing dictates from under. That's exactly what's happening here. We created a Congress to reflect the will of the people in creating rules, just like Dan was talking about a moment ago. And that's how our system works, especially on these major questions. That's for Congress to decide. It's not to be decided by people in the administrative state in Washington, D.C., who can't be fired, who are making twice the salaries that the average American makes, who are getting benefits unimaginable to the average American, and they arrogantly do it. And here's the worst part. When the consequences come in, they don't suffer them. Everyday people they regulate do. That is the Declaration of Independence was partly drafted and signed to eliminate that form of government, and that's what we're talking about here.
Well, listen, before I let you guys go, I'm sorry, Dan, did you want to add into this?
I just wanted to add to Tim's story there. Please. If you guys know Kevin Kosar over at American Enterprise Institute, he's done a lot of work on regulation. Oh, yeah. And he's proposed I associated him with the proposal to have a congressional regulatory office. Right now, all the regulatory expertise is in the executive branch. So they're happy to sort of defer to OIRA. But if we're going to get a handle on this, if there's authority in the Congress to weigh the benefits and the costs of regulations, to insist on having marginal analysis, to have retrospective analysis to see whether or not the regulations achieve what they were supposed to do and within the costs that they were expected to incur, and generating the benefits they're expected to incur. So restoring some authority to Congress, and then having Congress perhaps with the REINS Act have them be able to vote on regulatory decisions that come through. So they need to be empowered more, and there are a lot of interesting ideas gestating around Washington.
Now, before I let you guys go, and Tim, if you've done this before, forgive me, but I always like to ask my guests. I was going to do a podcast at one point about the outside interests of folks who work on policy issues like this, because I think it helps demystify who these people are. I'll start with you, Dan. So what are some of your outside interests when you're not doing your Ikensonomics Consulting? What are you out there doing?
Oh, wow. Well, I like to garden and landscape.
Excellent.
That's and walk. As I age, I mean, I used to run a lot, and I do ride a bike a little bit, but there's a lot of weight on my bones these days. So, but I like to be outside. I like to read history. And I like to criticize Washington.
Hear, hear. Good. I like it. Tim, what about you?
Beyond politics and policy, which is a never-ending source of joy for me, as I know it is for you, college football is sort of my passion. I'm a little bit in NFL, but really college football. I went to undergrad at Arizona State and then law school at Southern California. And so those are my two teams. They used to be in the Pac-12, no longer are. Got a Husky Australian Shepherd mix. And I know, Andrew, this will sort of definitely ring a bell with you. I've got two kids, son of 13, a daughter about to turn 11. And I will just say this, they're homeschooled. And my son is even more political at this age than I was. And to put that in context, my brother used to ridicule me for watching the 1980 Democratic convention when Carter was running against Reagan. And I'm shouting at the television by myself at what a liar Jimmy Carter is. And he's defaming Ronald Reagan. And my brother looks at me and says, "You're weird." Well, that's a large part of it, too, when you have kids. And so they're at least on the right track.
Well, I remember the first time one of my kids watched a presidential debate, and then that child asked, so if they answer the questions right, do they win? And I said, yes, that's exactly how it is.
In an ideal world, yes.
How do folks find out more about the work that both of you are doing?
Well, I have a website, Ikensonomics.com. I just started this year. I was at the Cato Institute for over 20 years and then had a little consulting experience outside of that. But most of my the work that I've done over the years on trade and regulation, you can find at the Cato website and
excellent.
Increasingly on my own website as that gets populated.
Almost got hired many years ago as the head of government affairs for Cato. Didn't happen, but I love the organization. Tim, how do folks find out more about CFIF?
Real easy. CFIF.org. That stands for Center for Individual Freedom. CFIF.org.
And I want to thank our guests for joining me today. Tim Lee is Senior Vice President of Legal and Public Affairs at the Center for Individual Freedom. Daniel Ikenson is the founder of Ikensonomics Consulting, also spent many years at the Cato Institute, which specializes in strategic analysis, issue advocacy, policy writing, and public engagement. And that's Ikensonomics, Ikensonomics is how you find it there. Listen, this brings us to the close of yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As always, if you are watching us on YouTube, you can check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms out there. If you're listening to us, check out our YouTube page, subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a review, and use that word of mouth. Let everybody you know how much you're enjoying The Lunch Hour. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.